This episode contains discussion of real-world violence, including murder and assault. It is explored with care, but some listeners may find it difficult. Please take care whilst listening. Peter Sutcliffe had finally been arrested. After years of uncertainty, years of investigation, and years of fear, the possibility that the Yorkshire Ripper had at last been identified brought something many people had not experienced for a very long time. Relief. For detectives who had devoted years of their lives to the inquiry, the arrest represented the possibility that the search was finally coming to an end. For communities that had lived alongside the threat of further attacks, it offered the hope that the violence might finally be over. And for the families of those whose lives had changed forever, it created the possibility that answers might at last begin to emerge. Yet history has a habit of becoming more complicated, just when people believe it is becoming simpler. Because although Peter Sutcliffe's arrest appeared to answer the biggest question facing the investigation, it also began creating new ones. At first, those questions were subtle, small inconsistencies, details that did not seem to fit as neatly as investigators might have expected. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that immediately threatened the growing belief that the Yorkshire Ripper had finally been found. But enough to create a sense that something was not quite right. Looking back now, there is an irony hidden within that moment. For years, investigators had been searching for certainty. Every major inquiry, every witness statement, and every new lead had carried the possibility of bringing them closer to the truth. Now, with Peter Sutcliffe in custody, certainty should finally have been within reach. Instead, a new kind of uncertainty was beginning to emerge. And at the centre of it sat a question that would force investigators to reconsider some of the assumptions that had shaped the inquiry for years. If Peter Sutcliffe was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper, who had been speaking on the tape? Welcome. It's a pleasure to have your company. I'm Jenny. I love history, and I am fascinated by the moments where human psychology collides with it in the worst possible ways. This is Hidden Chronicles, Season 3, The Yorkshire Ripper, Episode 14, The Unravelling. In the days following Peter Sutcliffe's arrest, there was a sense that the investigation might finally be coming to an end. For years, detectives had been chasing a man who had always seemed just beyond reach. Every promising lead eventually faded. Every breakthrough seemed to create as many questions as answers. The inquiry had grown to a scale few people could have imagined when the first attacks occurred. Thousands of statements had been collected. Thousands of names had passed through the system. Officers had spent years trying to make sense of information that seemed to grow faster than they could process it. Now, at last, they had a suspect sitting in custody. It is difficult to overstate what that must have felt like. Not celebration, not triumph, relief. The possibility that the uncertainty might finally be ending. The possibility that women would no longer have to live with the fear that had shadowed communities across Yorkshire for so long. The possibility that families might finally begin receiving answers to questions that they had carried for years. For a brief moment, it must have felt as though the investigation was moving towards a conclusion. Yet almost immediately, detectives began encountering something they had not expected. The more they compared Peter Sutcliffe to the picture they had spent years building, the more they found themselves confronting details that did not fit quite as neatly as they should have done. At first, those details appeared relatively small. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that suggested they had arrested the wrong man. The evidence connecting Sutcliffe to the attacks was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Detectives were not looking at an innocent man. They were looking at a suspect who was rapidly becoming the centre of one of the most significant criminal investigations in British history. And yet certain questions refused to disappear. One of those questions concerned a voice. For years, that voice had become one of the most recognisable features of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Detectives had listened to it. Journalists had discussed it. Members of the public had heard it. And gradually, it had become woven into the wider story of the case itself. The voice seemed to belong to the man investigators were hunting. The problem was that Peter Sutcliffe did not sound like that voice. At first glance, that might not seem particularly important. After all, voices can sound different in different circumstances. Recordings can distort speech. Memories can be unreliable. But the more closely investigators examined the issue, the more difficult it became to dismiss. Because this was not a minor discrepancy. It was a question that struck at the heart of something the investigation had believed for years. If Peter Sutcliffe was the Yorkshire Ripper, then who on earth had been speaking on the tape? To understand why this question mattered so much, we need to place ourselves back inside the investigation as it existed at the time. Today, we know that Peter Sutcliffe was responsible for these attacks. We know how the story ends. We know which information ultimately proved significant and which information did not. But we should remember detectives had no such advantage. They were attempting to solve a series of murders that had already spanned years. Women had lost their lives. Communities remained fearful. Public pressure continued growing. Every attack intensified the urgency of finding the man responsible. Under those circumstances, the tape appeared to offer something investigators had been searching for over a very long time. Direction. For years, the Yorkshire Ripper had existed largely as an unknown figure. Detectives could examine crime scenes. They could analyse witness statements. They could study patterns and behaviour. Yet the man himself remained frustratingly distant. And the tape seemed to change that. Suddenly, there was a voice, a personality, a man who appeared to be speaking directly into the investigation itself. Looking back now, it is easy to focus upon what the tape was not. It is easy to focus upon the fact that it did not belong to Peter Sutcliffe. Yet doing so risks overlooking why it became so influential in the first place. The tape mattered because it felt real. There is something uniquely persuasive about hearing another human voice. A voice creates a sense of connection that written words rarely achieve. It feels personal, immediate, authentic. It creates the impression that we are encountering a real individual rather than an abstract idea. For detectives attempting to identify an unknown offender, that distinction was enormously significant. The tape did not simply provide information. It appeared to provide understanding. And understanding can be a powerful thing. For years, investigators have been trying to construct a picture of the offender from fragments. Witness accounts offered one piece of the puzzle. Crime scenes offered another. Behavioural patterns offered another. The tape appeared to provide something capable of bringing those fragments together. The difficulty, of course, is that explanations can become persuasive long before they become accurate. That does not happen because people stop thinking critically. It happens because human beings naturally seek patterns and meaning. We want events to make sense. We want information to fit together. We want uncertainty to give way to understanding. Most of the time, that tendency serves us remarkably well. Occasionally, however, it can lead people towards conclusions that feel right without necessarily being correct. As investigators began comparing Peter Sutcliffe to the picture they had spent years building, they were slowly being forced to confront the possibility that this might be one of those occasions. The question was no longer whether the tape had influenced the investigation. The question was how much. The difficulty with influential ideas is that their impact is rarely obvious whilst they are taking shape. People do not usually wake up one morning and decide to organise their understanding of the world around a particular belief. The process is far more gradual than that. An explanation appears useful. It seems to fit the available information. It helps make sense of uncertainty. And over time it becomes part of the framework through which new information is understood. That was the position investigators found themselves examining. As the tape had not simply existed alongside the investigation, it had become part of it. For years, detectives had been trying to answer the same fundamental question: who was the Yorkshire Ripper? Every witness statement, every vehicle registration, and every new lead was assessed through that lens. The inquiry generated an extraordinary amount of information. far more than any individual could fully process alone. In circumstances like those, investigators need ways of organising what they are seeing. They need priorities. They need explanation. They need a sense of direction. And the tape? Well, the tape appeared to provide all three. That does not mean detectives abandoned other inquiries or stopped pursuing alternative leads. The reality was far more complicated than that. The investigation continued generating information from countless sources. New suspects emerged, new statements were collected, and new possibilities were explored. Yet all of that information still needed to be interpreted. And interpretation is rarely a neutral process. Human beings understand new information by connecting it to what they already believe. We compare unfamiliar facts to familiar explanations. We look for patterns. We search for consistency. Most of the time, that process happens so naturally that we barely notice it occurring. Only afterwards do we begin recognizing how influential those assumptions may have been. As Peter Sutcliffe's arrest forced investigators to re-examine the inquiry, they found themselves confronting exactly that possibility. The question was no longer whether opportunities connected to Sutcliffe had existed. They had. The interviews had happened. The vehicle inquiries had happened. The information had been available. The more uncomfortable question was why those opportunities had failed to alter the direction of the investigation in a more significant way. That answer could not be found in a single report or a single decision. Instead, it seemed to emerge from the cumulative effect of years of assumptions, priorities and interpretations interacting with one another. No individual moment explained everything. No single mistake explained everything. Yet when investigators began looking backwards, they found themselves returning to the same troubling conclusion. Peter Sutcliffe had not remained outside the investigation. He had remained inside it. And that realization would force detectives to confront some of the most difficult questions the inquiry had ever faced. As investigators looked back across the years of the inquiry, they found themselves revisiting events that had once appeared relatively ordinary. At the time, each of those events existed within its own context. A witness statement belonged to one inquiry. A vehicle check belonged to another. An interview raised certain questions, but not necessarily others. Viewed individually, none of them appeared capable of transforming the entire direction of the investigation. And that was part of the challenge. The significance of those events only became fully visible once Peter Sutcliffe's identity was known. Today, it is easy to place those moments together and view them as parts of a single narrative. We can move from one event to another and clearly see the connections linking them. We know which details matter because history has already revealed the ending. Investigators were not working with that advantage. For them, information arrived in fragments. A name here, a registration number plate here, a statement collected months apart from another piece of evidence. It is important to remember that the inquiry did not unfold as a neatly organised story as we know it. It unfolded as real investigations usually do, through a constant flow of information that was often incomplete, contradictory, and difficult to interpret. Yet the more detectives revisited the case, the more often they encountered the same uncomfortable pattern. Peter Sutcliffe kept appearing, not in a way that immediately identified him as the offender, not in a way that would have made his guilt obvious to everybody involved, but often enough to create a sense that the truth had been moving through the investigation for years without ever fully altering its course. That realisation carried a different weight from the questions surrounding the tape. The tape raised concerns about assumptions. Peter Sutcliffe raised concerns about opportunities. Because every review of the evidence seemed to reveal another moment where investigators had come close enough to touch the truth without fully recognising it. The closer people examined those moments, the harder they became to dismiss as simple coincidence. And yet they all remained difficult to explain. After all, the information had existed. The opportunities had existed. The inquiries had existed. What investigators were now trying to understand was why those pieces had failed to combine into a picture that pointed more clearly towards Peter Sutcliffe. That question would prove far more challenging than it first appeared, because answering it required more than identifying missed opportunities. It required understanding how people make sense of information in the first place. And that meant confronting the possibility that the greatest obstacle within the investigation had not always been missing evidence or missing suspects. Sometimes they had been the explanations used to understand the evidence that was already there. One of the reasons the Yorkshire Ripper investigation continues to fascinate people decades later is that the questions it raises are not confined to policing. They are human questions. Most people have experienced moments where they believe they understood a situation, only to discover later that important parts of that understanding were incomplete. The details may differ, but the experience itself is remarkably familiar. An explanation feels convincing. Events appear to fit together. The world seems to make sense. And then something changes. A new piece of information emerges. A forgotten detail takes on a new significance. An assumption that once felt reliable begins to look less certain than it did before. Suddenly, the explanation that seemed so persuasive no longer feels quite as secure as it did. And that process can be deeply uncomfortable. Not because people dislike being wrong, although many do. The deeper difficulty lies in the fact that understanding provides stability. It helps people navigate uncertainty. It offers a framework through which events can be interpreted and decisions can be made. When that framework begins to crack, uncertainty returns. Questions return. Doubt returns. And for investigators examining the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, that experience was unfolding on an enormous scale. For years, detectives had been trying to make sense of one of the most complex criminal investigations in British history. The explanations that they developed were not random. They emerged through years of hard work, discussion, and analysis. They helped provide direction within an inquiry that might otherwise have become impossible to manage. Yet Peter Sutcliffe's arrest was forcing people to reconsider some of those explanations. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to create uncertainty where certainty had once existed. Enough to prompt difficult questions about assumptions that had gradually become part of the investigative landscape. Enough to force investigators to look at information they believed they already understood. There is something revealing about moments like this. They remind us that understanding is never a finished product. It is something people build, test, and revise over time. Most of the time, those revisions are small. Occasionally, however, a discovery arrives that changes the way everything else is viewed. Peter Sutcliffe's arrest was one of those discoveries. It did not simply identify the offender. It altered the meaning of years of investigative history. Events that had once seemed unrelated suddenly appeared connected. Assumptions that once felt secure suddenly invited scrutiny. Questions that had once appeared settled were opened once more. And the deeper investigators explored those questions, the more they found themselves confronting an uncomfortable possibility. The investigation had not merely been trying to identify the Yorkshire Ripper. It had also been trying to understand him. And understanding, as they were now discovering, can sometimes be far more fragile than it appears. For a long time, one question remained unanswered. If Peter Sutcliffe had not recorded the tape, then who had? The answer would not arrive immediately. Even after the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had ended, the mystery surrounding the letters and tape remained unresolved. The recording had influenced one of the largest murder inquiries in British history. Yet the individual responsible for creating it remained unknown. In some ways, that uncertainty felt strangely appropriate. The tape had entered the investigation during a period defined by unanswered questions. It had helped shape assumptions, influence decisions, and alter the direction of the inquiry. Yet the person behind it remained hidden, existing almost as a shadow within the wider story of the case. Years passed. The investigation became history. Reports were written. Lessons were debated. The actions of detectives, senior officers, and investigators continued to attract scrutiny. Yet the question surrounding the tape remained. Who had been speaking? Eventually, advances in forensic science provided an answer. The man responsible for the letters and recordings was identified as John Humble, a man entirely unconnected to Peter Sutcliffe and entirely unconnected to the murders themselves. The revelation was significant. Not because it transformed what was known about Peter Sutcliffe. By that stage, his responsibilities for the attacks was already established. What it transformed was the understanding of everything that had surrounded the tape. The voice that had become one of the most recognizable features of the investigation did not belong to the offender. The letters that had influenced so much discussion and police work did not come from the offender. One of the most influential figures within the wider narrative of the Yorkshire Ripper investigation had never been the Yorkshire Ripper at all. There is something almost surreal about that realization. For years, investigators had searched for a killer while simultaneously engaging with a second individual, whose actions were quietly shaping the course of the inquiry. One man committed the crimes. Another inserted himself into the story surrounding them. The consequences of those actions would continue to be debated for decades. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of John Humble's identification was not who he was. It was what his existence revealed. The tape had never possessed influence because of who created it. The tape had possessed influence because people believed it. That distinction matters. Because it shifts attention away from the individual responsible for the hoax and towards the conditions that allowed the hoax to become so persuasive in the first place. The story of the tape is often remembered as a story about deception. In many ways, it is. But it is also a story about uncertainty, about the search for understanding, and about the extraordinary power of explanations that appear to make sense of a complicated world. Those themes had shaped the Yorkshire Ripper investigation from the beginning. And now, years later, they remained at the centre of its legacy. Looking back now, it can be tempting to search for a simple lesson within the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. A single mistake, a single decision, a single moment where everything went wrong. History rarely provides such neat conclusions. What makes this case so enduring is not that it offers easy answers. It is that it forces people to confront difficult questions. Questions about evidence. Questions about interpretation. Questions about how human beings make sense of uncertainty when the stakes could not be higher. For years, investigators searched for a man that they believed they were gradually beginning to understand. Every new piece of information appeared to bring them closer to that goal. Witness statements added detail. Investigative theories added detail. The tape appeared to add detail. Bit by bit, a picture emerged. The difficulty, as Peter Sutcliffe's arrest eventually revealed, was that parts of that picture did not belong to Peter Sutcliffe at all. That discovery did not erase the enormous effort invested in the investigation, nor did it diminish the commitment of those involved. What it revealed instead was something far more complicated: the difference between information and understanding, the difference between seeing and recognizing, the difference between certainty and truth. Those distinctions sit at the heart of the Yorkshire Ripper case. Because the investigation was never simply a search for evidence. It was also a search for meaning. A search for explanations capable of making sense of events that often seemed senseless. Like all human beings, investigators were trying to understand the world around them using the information available at the time. Most of the time, that process serves people remarkably well. Sometimes, however, reality proves more complicated than the explanations created to understand it. That possibility remains one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the entire case. Not because it belongs solely to the Yorkshire Ripper investigation, but because it belongs to all of us. Every person relies upon assumption. Every person builds explanations. Every person interprets the world through frameworks that feel persuasive and familiar. The challenge is recognizing when those frameworks no longer fit the evidence before us. And that is not easy. It never has been. Perhaps that is why the Yorkshire Ripper investigation continues to resonate decades later. Not simply because of the crimes themselves, but because of the questions they leave behind. Questions about certainty. Questions about understanding. Questions about how close people can come to the truth without fully recognizing it. And questions about what happens when that truth finally emerges. Peter Sutcliffe had been arrested. The mystery of the offender was over. The unravelling of everything surrounding him had only just begun. As the Yorkshire Ripper investigation entered its next chapter, one reality had become impossible to avoid. Peter Sutcliffe had been identified. Yet identifying him had not brought the certainty that many people expected. Instead, his arrest had exposed new questions, new contradictions, and new opportunities for reflection. The investigation had spent years searching for an unknown offender, and now it found itself examining the assumptions, decisions, and interpretations that had shaped that search. In many ways, that process was unavoidable. The Yorkshire Ripper case had never been simply a story about one man. It was also a story about fear, a story about uncertainty, a story about the challenges of making sense of events whilst they are unfolding. The deeper people looked, the more they discovered that the investigation contained lessons extending far beyond the crimes themselves. Lessons about evidence. Lessons about interpretation. Lessons about the dangers of becoming too attached to explanations that feel persuasive. And lessons about the importance of remaining open to possibilities that do not fit comfortably within what we already believe. Those lessons were not always easy. Some were deeply uncomfortable. Yet they remain important precisely because of that discomfort. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper did not end with Peter Sutcliffe's arrest. In many respects, it was only beginning to reveal its most difficult questions. Questions that would continue to shape discussions of the case for decades to come. And questions that remain relevant wherever people are asked to make sense of uncertainty, complexity, and human behaviour. In the next episode, we move beyond the arrest itself and into the aftermath that followed. Public scrutiny intensified. Questions surrounding the investigation continued growing. Attention increasingly shifted towards accountability, responsibility, and the difficult process of understanding what lessons could be learned from one of the most significant criminal investigations in British history. Thank you for listening. I'm really glad you joined me. If you're enjoying Hidden Chronicles, be sure to follow so that you don't miss what comes next. And if you have a moment, a rating on Spotify or Audible really does help more people discover the podcast. As always, take care and be gentle with what history leaves behind.